Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible sword. His truth is marching on.
On November 19, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln memorialized the ground on which roughly 165,000 Union and Confederate soldiers fought for the fate of the United States of America. With good reason, this ground in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, has continued to live on in the memory of Americans over 150 years later. Furthermore, when we reflect on the Civil War, it is often the warfare on our country's soil we remember most. The ground at Bull Run, at Shiloh, and at Antietam. However, unbeknownst to most Americans, during this tumultuous period, another story unfolded on the water, or to be more precise, under the water. This story didn't have as great an impact on the outcome of the war, but the story of Civil War torpedo boats and submarines did have a profound impact on the development of marine warfare technology in the United States. One such early innovation was the torpedo boat, the forerunner to the submarine. Today's episode centers on a small Confederate torpedo boat with a big ambition. The David, so named because of its minuscule size in contrast with its opponents, fittingly set out to destroy the Union's biggest and most powerful broadside ironclad, called the New Ironsides. On a misty night in October of 1863, the David set out on the water to slay its Goliath. However, the David isn't the beginning of the story of Civil War submarine development, so let's first take a step back. The story began early in the war with the Confederate Army both outnumbered and undersupplied. If there's one lesson to take away from this episode, it's the truth of the old adage, necessity is the mother of invention. The main character in the story of Civil War submarine development is the Confederacy because the South was in most need of new and creative ideas to win the war. The South had fewer men and fewer resources than the North. This disadvantage was no more stark than on the water because when the Confederacy seceded from the Union, the North retained almost the entire Navy. This was particularly problematic for the South as they had a huge coastline to defend. The Confederacy hired an oceanographer named Matthew Fontaine Maury to help protect its waterways, and he began developing floating mines, referred to as torpedoes, to defend against Union ships. Initially, Confederate leaders balked at these new weapons, dubbed Infernal machines, because of their deceptive nature. They considered them to be dishonorable and in contrast with a chivalrous code of war. Nonetheless, Maury won them over, and the Confederates soon found great success using his torpedoes to defend their rivers and harbors. However, with an extensive blockade of Union ships surrounding their harbors, the Southern Army eventually started looking for a way to bring the torpedoes to Union vessels, rather than wait for the Northern ships to blunder into the mines. Thus, the South began to develop torpedo boats. It should be noted that operable submarines had already been invented by this point in time. During the Revolutionary War, an American named David Bushnell invented a small one-man submersible called the Turtle and attempted to blow up the British HMS Eagle with it, history's first recorded underwater attack. Although Bushnell failed to sink the Eagle, General George Washington referred to his novel underwater vessel as, quote, an effort of genius, according to Mark Reagan in his book Submarine Warfare in the Civil War. A quarter of a century later, Robert Fulton, inventor of the steamboat, built 2 submarines during the Napoleonic Wars, but was unable to sell them to either the British or the French. Other than an alleged attack by an unidentified submarine during the War of 1812, there are no recorded submarine developments between Fulton's attempts and the Civil War. When the Confederacy began to explore ways to use torpedoes on the offensive, they started with a much simpler vessel than those developed by Bushnell and Fulton. The first model they produced for this aim was basically a 20-foot-long canoe. The innovation of this newfound torpedo boat was that it was fixed with a 20-foot pole, called a spar, used to plunge the torpedo into the enemy ship's hull. Then the torpedo would be detonated by pulling a lanyard connected to the explosive. This boat was invented by Confederate Army engineer Lieutenant Francis D. Lee, and after a few successful tests, it was ready for action. Lee's boat attempted an attack on the Union ship, the USS Powhatan, but failed because an oarsman turned the boat off course just before the torpedo hit the enemy boat's hull. The biggest downside to Lee's early torpedo boat model was that since it was oar-powered, its lack of propulsion made it ineffective in deeper, choppier waters, or in anything other than ideal weather conditions. The next step forward was a steam-powered torpedo boat, which brings us back to the David, the first important steam-powered torpedo boat developed by the Confederacy. The David was a 48.5-foot cigar-shaped vessel that could be submerged underwater to the point that only its hatch and smokestack were visible. It was fitted with a spar torpedo, based on Lee's design, that rested 6 feet below the water. Lieutenant William T. Glassell, who had helmed Lee's original torpedo boat in its attack on the Powhatan, was put in command of the vessel. After making some modifications and running some tests, Glassell chose the new Ironsides as his target. It was 8:30 p.m. when the David spotted the new Ironsides. Glassell cut the engine, and the David drifted towards its target. His plan was to attack at 9 p.m. when the tide changed. According to Milton F. Perry in his book Infernal Machines, when Glassell heard the gun from the new Ironsides marking the time, he said to his crew, "It is now 9 o'clock. Shall we strike her?" After a round of enthusiastic responses, Glassell turned the engine on and sped toward the Union vessel. The spar torpedo was lowered. Glassell and the 3 other crew members each held a loaded double-barreled shotgun. A sentinel on the new Ironsides spotted the wake of the David and informed the officer of the deck. Soon the officer's voice rang out into the night, "Boat ahoy! Boat ahoy!" The David came within firing range of the new Ironsides, and Glassell laid down the enemy officer with a blast from his shotgun. Then the David's torpedo rammed into the iron hull of its target and detonated the explosive. The new Ironsides shook violently. A geyser of water burst from the sea and covered the David, killing the engine. Believing his boat to be sinking, Glassell ordered his crew to abandon the ship. One crewman, who didn't know how to swim, stayed aboard the David. Another initially swam away, but eventually returned to the boat after seeing that it hadn't, in fact, sunk. The 2 were able to get the engine going again and sailed off to safety. Glassell was captured in the water by a Union vessel an hour after he jumped ship. The 4th crew member was later discovered by the new Ironsides crew, clutching the rudder chain of the Union ship. After all the mayhem, the new Ironsides was still standing. The failure of the torpedo blast to sink the ship was later attributed to a flaw in the spar that prevented it from reaching its expected depth in the new Ironsides hull by a foot. However, the mission was not without effect. According to Perry's book, Rear Admiral John A. Dahlgren stated the following in his report afterward. "Among the many inventions with which I have been familiar, I have seen none which have acted so perfectly at first trial. The secrecy, rapidity of movement, control of direction, and precise explosion indicate, I think, the introduction of the torpedo element as a means of certain warfare. It can be ignored no longer." Furthermore, it was later discovered that the David's torpedo did serious damage to the new Ironsides and put it out of commission for a year. The Union, of course, kept this a tightly held secret, and the Confederacy didn't find out about it until after the war. The close call also spurred the Union to implement meticulous measures to defend against potential torpedo boat attacks from that point on. As for the Confederacy, the relative success of the mission spurred them to develop further vessels based on the David model, but none were successful in combat. Despite their advances in underwater warfare, the Confederacy failed to sink an enemy ship with one of their torpedo boats. To recap, due to its massive disadvantage militarily, the Confederacy began experimenting early in the Civil War with floating torpedoes as a defense against the Union's powerful fleet. This led to Francis Lee's oar-powered torpedo boat model, which spurred the development of steam-powered torpedo boats like the David. While the David proved ultimately unsuccessful, it got the attention of leaders on both sides of the conflict and marked the introduction of infernal machines as an offensive weapon. In our next episode, we'll explore the South's foray into fully submersible submarine technology, focusing on the Pioneer and its successor, the Pioneer II. You can also read about one of the Confederacy's early submarines and the thrilling story of a Northern spy's attempt to gather intelligence on the secret vessel in History by the Slice co-producer Doug Peterson's novel, The Lincoln League. You can find the book online at Amazon and Barnes & Noble. We hope you enjoyed this slice of history. Until next time.